Okay, so I will just let you take over the class and
Okay,
anything you
welcome
want to share.
everyone, and nice to be with you. It's certainly an auspicious occasion. Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. And let me see here. Okay. Yes, and it's not a subject that we haven't discussed, but certainly we haven't exhausted all that there is to say about such a great person as Thakur and Bhaktivinoda. I've referred to him as the first Western convert to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and that was appreciated by persons outside of our Sangha who notified me about that. So I think we'll touch on that a little bit in the course of the discussion. Where we'll go, I'm not sure, but we, based on the inspiration, insight of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, refer to our Sangha in a broader sense as an extension of the Bhaktivinoda Paribar, so the family of Bhaktivinoda, the spiritual family of Bhaktivinoda. And I have mentioned in the past, it's worth repeating, that there's a precedent for such. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's thought that the Paribars have to have their beginning with the immediate associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, like Nityananda Prabhu, Advaita Gadadhar, Rupa Goswami, and so forth. So Bhaktivinoda Paribar, by that standard, would seem inappropriate. But as I've said before, there are other precedents. The Narottam Paribar comes to mind. The his name is escaping me. Shamananda Paribar, also. Each of these great luminaries appeared after the disappearance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and their their gurus were, and Param gurus in the case of Shamananda Prabhu, were direct associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So, because of their contributions in the case of Narottam, wide dispensation. In the case of Shamananda, some very extraordinary internal esoteric developments. They have been, the lineages stemming from them have been referred to as Shamananda Paribar, Narottam Paribar, rather than, for example, in the case of Narottam, the Lokanath Paribar, whom he's the guru of and who disciple of, and who was the immediate associate of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So that precedent is there, and furthermore, the very idea of such a necessity is interesting and endearing in many respects, and has some substance to it, but at the same time, it is somewhat actually external and somewhat of a detail. And unfortunately, and this was brought up by Bhaktivinoda, and hopefully we'll get to that or touch on that. The idea of such a necessity, with the Paribar being directly connected in the unbroken chain in literal sense of the Guru Parampara, is a bit of a Kanishta Adhikari notion. So Bhaktivinoda Parivar, Vijay. And I'll come back to that. But Thakur was born in, I believe, 1838 in West Bengal, in the Ula district, and he was born of a Kayasta family. It's interesting because, of course, he became the great luminary that he was, and we'll talk about that, but without having hailed from a distinguished, in terms of the social religious structure of the time, family. He wasn't from a Brahmin family. He wasn't from the Vaishnava perspective, one of the Goswami, Jati Gosai Goswami families, which would have been Brahmins as well. He wasn't a renunciate in the overt sense, which would have brought him, of course, that doesn't have to do with his birth, but his character, but rather from a Kayasta family, which is a technically speaking, to Sudra family, but they were elevated in terms of practical activity to take up positions of management and clerics and in his case work in the judicial system at the time. We may recall from Chaitanya Lila itself that Ramananda Roy was from a Kayasta community. He became a political appointee, kind of a governor or ambassador of the Rajput Rudra in his time, but not a particularly distinguished family, but nonetheless not a poor family, and they were his family, of the beginning of what developed into a recognizable middle class in India. I should say in Calcutta, in West Bengal, in that area. I can't really say it to what extent there was a middle class developing throughout India, but the capital, not only of India, but in many respects the capital of the world was Calcutta, because the British Empire was the most prominent, the British government was the most prominent influence in the world. And it was colonizing around the world and so forth. It is said that the sun never set on the British Empire. It was so spread so far and wide, and India was one of its big conquests, if you will, the colonization of India. And Calcutta was the capital, and it was so centrally located compared to, say, London, in terms of trade routes and so forth. It became the center, really. It became the New York, if you will, from an American perspective, the Big Apple of the world. It was really the hub of all types of, as I say, trade, and in all types of markets then were available, products and so forth in Calcutta. And above all, it was the center of intellectual discussion, the discussing of ideas and philosophical thought for the whole world. And so was a very special place, and for religious discussion. And this was a kind of meeting of the East and the West. The West had developed to a certain extent, materially speaking, in ways that exceeded, you could say, the development within India. And meanwhile, India had this very different from the Christian, British, Western religious idea, a spiritual perspective that was odd, pagan from the Christian point of view, but not the ordinary. Hindus weren't the ordinary type of people to convert to Christianity. While they were, I suppose, pagan from a Christian point of view, they had books. It wasn't witchcraft and sorcery and shamanism and so forth. They had texts, and they were written in Sanskrit, a very developed language, and so on and so forth. So there was a big exchange of ideas. And then for the Hindus, so many big, very significant historical persons in the Hindu community: Ram Mohan Roy, Dwijendranath Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, who met with Einstein, and so forth. We're all in the mix of an emerging middle class in Calcutta and the discussion of ideas. And so, while born in Ula district, Bhaktivinoda Thakur moved for his teenage years into Calcutta. And there he was schooled in the British system. And he was in the mix of all of these ideas. And so he was familiar with Schopenhauer and Hegel, Kant, and Berkeley and other Western philosophers and their ideas. And of course, he was also educated on the other side with Shankar's Mohanism and other schools of Indian thought, in the mix of which Vaishnavism was not very prominent. It had receded, as the Gita says, sometimes the tradition does, by the influence of time, into the background, and it was not really part of the mix of ideas and religious reform and new light, and looking, let's say, for example, at the Hindu perspective in light of new insights about the nature of the world, science, Western philosophy, and so forth. This had happened to Christianity earlier on, when the Christian faith-based tradition had to interface with ideas of Aristotle that kind of began Christian theology and rationalizing about faith in relation to observation and what the faith tradition had thought. You have another example would be the Copernican revolution, where it was thought that I guess I never read it, but the Bible taught that the Earth was a geocentric rather than a heliocentric perspective. I think Galileo might have almost gone to the guillotine. He lost his head over that. So, but eventually that perspective prevailed, and faith was challenged by objective observation and reason, and then strengthened ultimately by it. So this was happening to Hinduism at this point. So it was kind of a renaissance, if you will, for Hinduism. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was in the mix of all this, but as I say, Gaudiya Vaishnavism was not very much in the mix of it. That doesn't mean to say that there weren't saintly persons within Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but they were in the Dhams, rather than in Calcutta. They were not interfacing with such ideas. There's even evidence, speaking of the Copernican revolution, as I have just moments back, there's some interesting documentation of how that particular insight was ignored by the Vrindavan Goswamis in their time, whereas it was the challenge that presented to traditionalists in India was taken up by some Indians who didn't fare so well against it. Some integrated it, and so on and so forth. This was, of course, quite earlier on than the time we're talking about, the birth of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and the position of Calcutta and the British Empire, and so forth. But by the time of Bhaktivinoda, such influences, insights, and so forth could not be ignored if your religious tradition was to have power, influence, credibility in those times. The Goswamis and Vrindavan could ignore it. They were busy just establishing the basic tenets of their new Chaitanya Sampradaya, if you will. And that was a distant development that they didn't really have time for. But in time, Gaudiya Vaishnavism could not ignore it if it was to be alive and vital in the world. But no one was taking up the challenge. And perhaps they didn't even recognize that there was such a challenge. Renunciates, Babajis living as recluses and so forth. They were not concerned with that, which is a position to take. You may not be concerned with all types of, just be concerned with the ideas and the way the picture is painted literally in the Bhagavatam, and chant Hare Krishna and be happy. But it's hard to ignore in our the rumblings of the world and insights and cultural changes, social changes, and so forth. But as I say, Gaudiya Vaishnavism was not well respected in this developing middle class of educated Hindus, educated and religious Hindus. It was alive and well, to some extent, in the person of sadhus, in the dhams, but at the same time, there was a lot of misrepresentation of it, and a lot of mistaking or conflating principles with details, which ends up being a dogmatic, kind of lifeless presentation. So it wasn't in the mix. And indeed, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was schooled against it by the Advaitins, by the Brahmo Samaj, by the British, Christian thinking, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting that here he was in this mix and being educated and systematically, even to an extent, educated against Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He confessed in his famous speech entitled The Bhagavad, which he delivered in Dinajpur in 1869 when he was 31 years old. This speech is electrifying. It really speaks so loudly as to who Bhaktivinoda Thakur is. He's only 31 years old, and he came out with a, in spite of being educated against the Bhagavatam and confessing in the speech that's how that type of bias against the Bhagavatam he had developed through his education, dismissed it altogether. Here's all these ideas and religious reform going on, and it's an exciting time. And Gaudiya Vaishnavism is not even in the mix. The Bhagavatam is just like, oh, that's not even part of the discussion. That's some playboy out there, that it's immoral. It's that foolish, ignorant people think is God. Hmm? That's how he was taught to think and thought. Hmm? And in spite of all of this disparaging, from a Gaudiya perspective, influence, he somehow surfaced with a understanding of the Bhagavatam that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself had and held close to his heart. And this is what came out in the speech. And that speech is so electrifying because it's so spiritually deep and internal, yet so universal at the same time. It really exemplifies this, his ability to and tendency to gravitate towards the essence and never mistake details for principles, which is really the death of a tradition in a sense. So at 31 years old, I mean, some of you have read it. It's been published. It's so electrifying. You should sit down today if you have a copy with friends and read through it. The universality of it is so compelling. It's so uniting. The world today is very divided in our country, in the United States in particular, but other places as well. And in contrast, it's so universal and uniting of a spirit, just very, without, as I say, compromising the depth. And he's really speaking about the Bhagavatam is the heartbeat of the absolute, and you're not going to get closer to him than that. Yet it's all encompassing, and he, as such, he acknowledges truth everywhere, and he's speaking about the Bhagavatam, and in the context of doing that, saying it's not all in your own book. And his book is the Bhagavatam. And the Bhagavatam is saying it's not just in this book. But we can't say enough about it. But it's everywhere to one extent or another, but it's said in such a way there that you think, well, it's mostly here. This is his opinion. So very, very compelling, powerful speech. And this is as a 30-year-old, 31-year-old man. And from that, he brought Gaudiya Vaishnavism onto the world stage of the world religions. I mean, it's an extraordinary accomplishment. And of course, it extends through his community, his parivar, through Bhaktisiddhanta, through A.C. Bhaktivinoda, Swami, Prabhupada, and so forth. The whole world that has been touched to whatever extent, or whoever is anywhere in the world by Gaudiya Vaishnavism, is all coming from this extraordinary contribution of Bhaktivinoda. I mean, he has been written about now by a number of scholars who have just looked into his person and contribution in his times. And I think that they've realized that while persons like Rabindranath Tagore are well-known names, like, as I said, he was a poet, but a philosopher. He met with Einstein. There was a meeting of science and humanities and so forth. And other names that I've been, Aurobindo Ghosh and others that were prominent at the time. Bhaktivinoda's prominence has outlasted that time. So those names are, nobody's writing about those, exploring those, but the contribution of Bhaktivinoda has come to light, so to speak. Even in academia, he's a very interesting subject. There are at least half a dozen PhD dissertations, not all by one or two by devotees who were kind of discovering Bhaktivinoda Thakur in terms of who he is, what his contribution was, but by other academics. And therein, I read one comment that described him as the most prominent Vaishnav in the whole world, the whole world of India, the whole of the Vaishnav community, with millions of followers. I guess he's speaking of as it is today, with millions of followers. So Bhaktivinoda Thakura, I mean, we the disciples of Prabhupada like to speak about his contribution, and it's immense and immeasurable and so forth. But to put it in perspective, in his own words, well, let us refer to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, when Bhaktivinoda Thakur said, in the Sankirtan of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his associates, which he witnessed through his internal visions, still playing out in Navadvip Dham, he said, I am just a sweeper in front of the Sankirtan. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, and I am one straw in the broom of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And Prabhupada, how he thought about Bhaktisiddhanta, he became just like a child when he just mentioned his name. He was humbled at the contribution of his Guru Maharaj. So we got a big, great, and great grandfather, and good reason to refer to our tradition, as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur chose to do, as the Bhaktivinoda Paribar. That idea, of course, meets with some really Kanishta Adhikari opposition that is clothed as the most esoteric, deep, and spiritual insight into the tradition. That's how it's clothed, but if you take it apart in its naked form, it's just a Kanishta Adhikari, dogmatic, sectarian perspective. I mean, we can look to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself as an example. What can we do? Who is the what is the paribar of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu? He's an extraordinary spiritual person. That cannot be denied. If he's not found in the scripture, well, we better rewrite the scripture, write a new book, write a new verse, or find a way to fit him in there. Otherwise, we have to throw out the scripture. Would be the way to look at it. And that's pretty much what the Goswamis did. They found ways to write him in and interpret verses grammatically and substantially in ways that had never been understood before, to be references to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And again, that was their idea. Well, if he's not in the book, then we don't need the book. So we do need the book, and he is in the book. and what he says is what he embodied. They, as I like to say sometimes, they located him on the scriptural map, which was the way of determining what's what at the time. There was a Puranic sense of history, so he had to be an avatar, as described in the Puranas and so on and so forth. So the Kali Yuga avatar, and they put it all together like this. There may be other ways to talk about that. That's fine. But the point is that his spirituality was undeniable. And so it is with Bhaktivinoda Thakur, so much so that I think it was Shishu Kumar Ghosh, famous journalist and devotee, also referred to him as the seventh Goswami. And he was the seventh Goswami, not only in terms of his writing, but also in terms of his discovering the birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and bringing attention to Navadvip, like the Goswamis in their time, following Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, brought attention to Vrindavan. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went to Vrindavan, nobody knew where Radhakund or Shamakund was, and so forth and so on. He went, and then he sent Rupa and Sanatan there to establish that, and they did. It was one of the fourfold, I think, orders he gave to Sanatana Goswami. The Rupa Goswami also took to heart. But Bhaktivinoda did that, in a sense, in relation to Navadvip. Plus he wrote about 32 or 5 books, and published more than 100 books that he either edited or translated and so forth. So he's a very prolific author at the same time. And again, while he was interfacing with the modern world and giving Gaudiya Vaishnavism to it to examine and think about, which they still are, it's not like Black Lives Matter or something. It's not on the front page type of an issue and so forth. But the extent to which it has become a subject of interest is remarkable in comparison to, as I'm explaining, where it was when Bhaktivinoda Thakura hit 31 and gave his Bhagavad speech. I mean, the people whom he was surrounded by, schooled by, educated by, who thought he had promised, the different groups that thought he'll join us surely any day now. Bhaktivinoda is going to join us, and our group will be better for it considerably. Suddenly he joined the Gaudiyas. It was like, what? They thought he was, had a lapse of reason, but he just came out with such good reasoning as to Gaudiya Vaishnavism that it is as not only widely spread, we know about it, it's a thing, there's people all over the world chanting and so forth. It may be not that influential, small in number in some respects. They're not on the front page at the moment, but that besides the group itself, the interest in it in academia and in other religious traditions that have to think about it, talk about it in relation to their own and so forth, this never would have happened. Never would have happened without Bhaktivinoda, in whom the idea and the inspiration came, and the first and very powerful foot forward was placed. Obviously, Bhaktisiddhanta, in the words of Puja Pachita Maharaj, gave shape to the vision of Bhaktivinoda, and in his words also, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada took it all over the world. But he himself always considered this inappropriately so. His movement, ISKCON, as it was the movement of Bhaktivinoda. So, on the one sense, on the one side, he was interfacing with the modern world and speaking in a universal way. He took rather, as I've said before, a perennialist type of perspective. And in that, what I mean is he acknowledged the truth in all religious traditions while speaking about the virtues of his own. He, in a very broad way, he considered Krishna in Braj as the perfect object of love, the deity in relation to whom the fullest expression of love of God could be experienced. And that love of God, which is the other side of rasa. You have the object of love, Krishna, and then you have the love itself, right? So you have the Vishai means object, Vishai alambana, the object of love, and the Ashray alambana. Ashray means the shelter of, so the shelter of that love, or the vessel of that love. The love personified, like Radha is the vessel of the love, the fullest expression of love, and Krishna is the object of love, perfect object of love. You can't have one there without the other. You can't have Krishna in Swayam Bhagavan without Radha. He corresponds with her vision. So he appropriately spoke of Krishna as the perfect object of love, that form of the Godhead with whom love in all of its nuance can be experienced. And that's really rather objective. Nobody else is speaking about how you can have romantic love with God, friendly love, although in a generous way. Bhaktivinoda Thakur would say things like, in Christianity we have friendly love, we have brotherly love, Sakya. But here we have Madhurya. It's generous to speak about it like that. But while doing that, in terms of his perennialist type of approach, he said, and he more or less said the human heart is the ashray. Now, this could be misinterpreted, I think, to be a theological statement to the effect that bhakti is inherent in the jiva, and some people have taken it like that. And in some places in his writing, it's understandable how they may have taken it in that way, because he kind of went in that direction. But I think this really the spirit, if you look at him carefully, of what he was trying to do was to say that the capacity to love God is inherent in everyone's heart, in every human being. And it's from the North Pole to the South Pole, from the educated people to indigenous, uneducated people. There is a capacity in every human heart to love God, and there are different traditions that tender to that and bring it out, serve to bring it out to one extent or another. They bring it out by their methodology and conceptual framework, and that then, to the extent that the jiva, who has that capacity, lends himself, his effort, to that particular system. But that the capacity to love God is inherent in all human beings. It's a natural phenomenon. It's universal. You'd have to argue with Freud, I guess, but it's this was very this is a kind of a perennialist idea. And to say, of course, this is accurate, that the human heart, if you will, is the capacity to love God is there, is accurate in terms of the Goswamis, founding acharyas, theology. That's not to say that bhakti is inherent in the jiva, but the capacity to love and receive bhakti, and a invitation, so to speak, from that side through one tradition or another. That capacity is there in the human heart. So this was a way, one kind of example of how he universalized, and very much very interesting to give such focus to a particular sect, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, bring it to light, all in the context of speaking about our way is not the only way. There are other ways, other trajectories to transcendence. They're all speaking about the same thing to one extent or another, which is a very perennialist perspective. So this was his, you could say it was his method, but it was his natural, I would say, also way of thinking. You could say that he systematically arrested authority from the existing Gaudiya Vaishnavas. But another way to look at it, well, they didn't have authority within the middle class that was developing in Calcutta at the time. They had some authority in the villages and amongst uneducated people who were maybe nominally Vaishnavas, and Vaishnavas in name only, born in Vaishnava families, got their initiation formally, and so forth. But the middle class wasn't interested in. He became the authority by without trying to be the authority, just by his person. And so he, while working in this way with the modern world, and on the other side, he's also working with the problems within Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the misrepresentation of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He's kind of speaking to that as well. I mentioned it earlier, the idea of, this idea of the Siddha Pranali. So you had to be in a line of perfect siddhas back to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Otherwise, it's not going to come to you. And it's a beautiful idea and so forth. But it's very, very practical. If you look at any number of the unbroken lines of siddhas, you'll have very good reason to think, well, some of these aren't siddhas. They're just persons that are in the line, and just to call him a siddha doesn't make him one. Let me give you an example. There's Bijay Krishna Goswami is a famous member of the Advaita Paribar, the community of, actually the Advaita Vamsa, the family lineage of Advaita Charya. He was so prominent at the time, early in his life, that members of that Advaita Vamsa considered him to be have been prophesied in Lochandas Thakur's book Chaitanya Mangal, as a recoming of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the family of Advaita. There's some verse in there that could be perhaps construed like that, and Vijay Krishna Goswami was thought by them to be such. Interestingly, as an aside, Vijay Krishna Goswami, I think he was the 10th generation in the Advaita family lineage, the Vamsa. He had his whole life affinity for Sakya-rasa, just an aside. But here he was a Siddha, so thought to be, in the line in a prominent way, and he came in touch around these times with the Brahmo Samaj, which was anti-guru, and looked at the scriptures in a different way. And he gave up becoming a Siddha in the line, considered it an ancestral line only, and became a member of the Brahmo Samaj. Of course, once he was in the Brahmo Samaj, he tried to incorporate Nam Sankirtan into it, and he did to some extent. Eventually, he left the Brahmo Samaj also. And he's a great person in his own right, but he was kind of bouncing around from group to group himself, and denounced himself, the line that he's in, as being nothing more than ancestral, rather than spiritual in all respects. He's a prominent example worth bringing up. So it's one thing to in name refer to a line. Pranali means line. Siddha means perfect masters. It's another thing to be perfect. Something's better than nothing, you could say. So something may come through, and wherever it does, this was the insight of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, of course, practical insight, it should be acknowledged. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur as well, who was acknowledging in different traditions and so forth, to a different extent, the dispensation of divinity was present. So if out of nowhere he appeared, then it must have been Krishna's own arrangement to send him something like that. Seventh Goswami. So people started to reason like this. Although he had his lineage, he had his Siddha Pranali, it's apparent that, and I've written about this recently in my articles about Anangamanjari, that in his own line, Diksha line, he differed from some of the significant theological perspectives that were espoused by the founder of the Bhagnapar line of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So instead he aligned himself with the Goswamis' theology. So he took that theological liberty. It's not just a sectarian argument when we say that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was more than his line, put together, at least for a few generations. It's very, 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 very practical. So, as I said earlier, like we have to locate Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we have to identify Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktisiddhanta used to say, well, we find in him things that are not there in Bipin Bihari Goswami. He was initiating guru, not to dismiss Bipin Bihari Goswami, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur never did, but his contribution exceeded the contribution of its whole line put together. So to call it the Bhaktivinoda Paribar is appropriate. So he was a reformer. He was a reformer in his typical eclectic and kind of broad-minded spirit. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur followed the work of Bhaktivinoda in terms of trying to reform the tradition with an entirely different method. He was more like meeting head-on in a collision with members of the tradition. But he was kind of taking the ball, if you will, from from Bhaktivinoda in a handoff, and then making a breakaway. And so they look different in their approach, even though they're doing the exact same thing. And who can deny it? That Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was the prominent disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. The world would not know over about Bhaktivinoda if it weren't for Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who made it his mission to publish the works of Bhaktivinoda Thakur primarily, and give shape, as I said earlier, according to Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, to the vision and ideals of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So, nowadays, there are some who say, there's a book been written, The Other Side of Bhaktivinoda. It's not the other side of Bhaktivinoda. This is the esoteric side of Bhaktivinoda that brings up the philosophical, theological ideas that we find in his lineage that he never espoused, never voiced, never wrote about, never gave any attention to, as if those were actually the secret inner ideas of Bhaktivinoda that he didn't bring out. And this is the real esoteric Bhaktivinoda. Some of my godbrothers, at a certain point in ISKCON's history, after the passing of Prabhupada, left ISKCON and took shelter of the brother of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who was also initiated by Bhaktivinoda. And interestingly, the most prominent of those told me that we wanted that connection with Bhaktivinoda. And if you know anything, what he was really saying and feeling is, we want that connection with that universality of Bhaktivinoda, that spiritual essence of that saragrahi sensibility of Bhaktivinoda, not a kanishta adhikari. It has to be done just like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or you're out. And dogmatic type of presentation that tends to conflate details again with principles and so forth. But then they came to conflate, some of them, the principles with the details, and you have to have it just like this in an unbroken law. Otherwise I just looked at that reasoning and I said, well, if Prabhupada, as you reason, is in some unbroken line, I guess unbroken lines work because the mantras are working pretty good for me that I've received. So I'll just base it on my experience here. If your teaching contradicts the distinct spiritual experience I'm deriving from the mantra, I have to choose the mantra. I can't give up the mantras. I told him when I spoke to one of my godbrothers about this, I said, you must have been lacking experience at the time to, they were working for me. Anyway, we were friends, but it's happening, today too. This is like this is natural tendency to lean towards a provincial and dogmatic, less than dynamic notion and understanding of spirituality and one's own tradition. And Bhaktivinoda was, as I say, just the antithesis of that. In his own term that he invoked, Saragrahi, an essence-seeking Vaishnava, he really personified this, and is a perfect person, really, to bring out that much more. As I said, there have been a number of doctoral theses on him and writings about him and so forth. But he's a perfect person to, as a householder. I think he fathered 10 or 12 children. He worked in the British government. Interestingly about him is that unlike practically all of the thinkers in Calcutta at the time who were religious reformers of Hinduism, he was not a nationalist. He wasn't all up in arms about the British. Well, there are bad things about it, that can be said, but his concern was not at all nationalism, but beyond internationalism, if you will. It's something that distinguishes him from all of the other thinkers in that milieu at that time. It's an interesting point, given some of the nationalist perspectives in the world today that are an anathema, just an extension of the bodily conception of life. As good as Gandhi's movement was, Swaraj, liberation from the British to be an Indian is a far cry from what the term Swaraj in scripture, what mukti really means, right? It means to say that his spiritual perspective, his theology, was not tinged by any nationalistic or other sectarian bodily identification, upadhi. And you find that. That was a remarkable thing about Prabhupada, that he comparatively, because I met a number of Gaudiya Vaishnavas in different lineages who I was once walking in Vrindavan. There was an assembly of sadhus gathering at one temple, and I thought, wow, let's go and check it out. They wouldn't let me in because I was white. White lives matter. No, Gaudiya Vaishnava lives matter. One of my godbrothers was part of a mission, in the absence of Prabhupada, had taken shelter of another mission in India where he was stationed, and was led by a disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakura, and the members felt that if they touched the shadow of that devotee, they would become contaminated. So these are all caste type ideas, varnashram type ideas, infiltrating into tinging the purity of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Nationalism is another, casteism, and so forth. All of these things were something that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teaching completely transcends, and it was very much there in Bhaktivinoda, very much there in my guru, where some of his godbrothers would be careful or concerned not to eat grains cooked by Prabhupada's disciples because they had a bad background in their estimation. They came from outside of India and so forth. So, but Prabhupada was not like that at all. And it's very much in this way he carried the spirit and holy spiritual perspective of Thakur Bhaktivinoda. So these are a few thoughts on the great Thakur on this holy day, and I'd like to take a moment and ask if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask or comments they'd like to add to the discussion.
If someone has a question, you could press the raise your hand thing, or you could ask it in the chat, because we have it to where you can't unmute yourself.
I see.
Oh, yeah, okay, I can unmute.
Sarah Louise.
Yeah, let me see.
She's commenting that Bhaktivinoda was behind sending the first literature to reach the Western world in 1896, year of Prabhupada's birth. His book, what was it? The Life and Teachings of Sri Chaitanya, something like that, reached McGill University in Canada, and she's wondering what the academics thought of it. It's hard to say what they thought of it. He also corresponded with, or he wrote to, who are referred to as the first American transcendentalists. What is his name? Thoreau. Yeah, Henry David Thoreau and others. He found their developing interest in Eastern philosophy, the Gita, and so forth, was something that he had heard about, took note of, and wrote to them. Of course, it's not, postal system wasn't like it is now, in need of repair, but in the United States, but there was no email, and so either whether they received those letters or not is unknown, but his insight to reach out to them the first American transcendentalists. Interestingly enough, there is a sense that with the pandemic and extended related issues, byproducts of this, that the world will turn more towards the American original transcendentalist perspective, at least of self-reliance and so forth. But anyway, yes, he wrote to them. He sent the book, and how it was received, it's probably hard to say without some follow through and his personal association and so forth. It probably sat in a library as a curious and interesting piece of from the East. It took the follow through of someone like Prabhupada, for example, to step on the shores here and exemplify the teaching personally and capture some Western converts and so forth. But yeah. What else?
I know that Panchatattva had a question, and I'm asking him to unmute.
Panchatattva, proper glorification, action of Prabhupada. Yes.
If I'm unmuted, you had talked, you've talked in the past about proper glorification of Srila Prabhupada, and we just had Srila Prabhupada's Vyas Puja. And so I spoke about that, about your concepts and putting Srila Prabhupada in context, specifically with Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakura's contribution. And it was quite an eye-opener for most devotees to hear that. But yeah. I think it, for me, when I first heard the concept from you years ago, it helped tremendously. Specifically, I think you told me I wouldn't be here without Bhaktivinoda Thakur's contribution. And in the past, I thought, well, I'm here because of Srila Prabhupada, but to extend it, back to Bhaktivinoda Thakur and back to the Goswamis is really quite powerful concept.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, you might want to talk a little bit about or comment about what proper glorification of Srila Prabhupada means in the context of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. Obviously, it probably didn't appear in a vacuum, and often it's thought like that, and it was experienced like that to some extent. Also, out of nowhere, there he was, came into your life, and he's talking about things like disciplic successions and infallible books, and it's all figured out, and here it is, and it worked pretty good. But he was a kind of, at the time, a lone representative and luminary of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which had the lights of which Gaudiya Vaishnavism had dimmed in India. Excuse me. Also, in comparison to the very bright and luminous mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who opened 64 monasteries in India and was bringing in educated people, not just village boys, but men and women with college degrees and so forth, giving up Gandhi's movement to join the Gaudiya Math and so forth, critiquing the tradition itself and so on and so forth. All his revolutionary steps and innovation, which was thought to be deviation by those who conflated, again, details with principles and so forth. Though that light dimmed considerably, the passing of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in time. I think he left in 1936. It wasn't until 1965 that Prabhupada came to America. So 30 years later, and then he lit up the Western world, and we were in the newspapers and so forth. Hare Krishna was an epidemic, and members of Congress were concerned about the proportions, to, the extent to which it was influencing people. And Prabhupada was thinking all publicity is good publicity. He was right at the time. And you and I, Panchadad, were very much involved in that dissemination of his books, which was controversial at the time. So, so he kind of appeared like to us, like out of nowhere. We didn't know any history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism or anything. But I think that obviously, if you really want to know Prabhupada, then you want to know who his friends were, who his associates were, something about his guru, his Param guru, the context, which, he appeared out of a vacuum, but he didn't say he appeared out of nowhere. He said the opposite. But we didn't have the thought or the time or the necessity to look into it. But if you do look further into it, that's, the first place you're going to go. And then you're going to get some context, which then you're going to better understand what happened to you and why it happened the way it did and so forth. So it can only enrich your own understanding, even while it appears on its face to be going in the opposite direction. Like some people say, well, why do I have to hear about Bhaktivinoda? Prabhupada did everything for me. It's like a crazy thing to say, but some people think like that. Why should I read Bhaktivinoda's books? I haven't read all of Prabhupada's books or something like that. Maybe you should read all of Prabhupada's books, but he does quote Bhaktivinoda, and it's a natural place to go. I mean, it was very natural for me from the very get-go. I mean, I was famous for selling Prabhupada's books, but in the early days in Los Angeles, in the Culver City, Venice, what is it called? The Culver City Temple, there, the Prabhupada sent a whole container of books from Gaudiya Math, and I used to sell them at the Sunday feast to devotees. We had Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, teachings of Lord Chaitanya. I didn't even think we had the full edition of the Bhagavad Gita at that time. Maybe the Nectar Devotion, but they had all these little booklets, Gaudiya Math books and stuff. So I read the Benglish, as I call it, edition of the Jaiva Dharma, half Bengali, half English, like in 1973. And I liked that, kind of a thing. So, but a lot of devotees, didn't, and it's really unfortunate. Like I say, to know the history, the Prabhupada in context is only to understand him better, and he does appear in time and circumstance with a particular mission, that he's empowered for, and so forth. We can look at the associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Each of them did everything, but each of them did things that the others didn't do. Rupa Goswami didn't do what Nityananda Prabhu, and Nityananda Prabhu didn't do what Rupa Goswami did, but they both did everything. Something like that. Bhaktivinoda did everything. He said, I left the world, my work undone. When asked about that, Prabhupada said, he could have done everything, but he left something for us to do. So that was his mercy. Give us some service. So, yeah, it's I think just fairly common that a less than dynamic understanding of his own tradition will come amongst the majority members to be the prominent understanding, and thus the need of ongoing reform and unsettling of members with preaching that isn't just a pat on the back, but makes them think and rethink and give up ideas that they think are central to or substantial in terms of the tradition that often, as it turns out, may not be. So yeah, I mean, for me, to meet Prabhupada's dear friend and godbrother, whom he hosted for 6 years in his house, Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj, was very. I thought you couldn't be in a better place to learn more about Prabhupada, even though he had a comparatively relative perspective on Prabhupada from mine. He would give an example. The child will have an absolute perspective in terms of his love of the parent, but a relative one between brothers and sisters, the siblings. They all have this, dad's right, mom's right, but you're wrong. No, I'm right, you're wrong, amongst themselves and so forth. So it's very interesting that the very thing that you might think, and devotees shy away from what you're talking about and hearing about this perspective, for fear of losing some appreciation for Prabhupada or being somehow having him diminished in their mind. It actually enhances their understanding. So it's a natural progression. I used to say to some devotees, well, where you want to go, where you feel Prabhupada is, Sridhar Maharaj is there too. So you got a chance to meet him now. You might as well meet him now. He's going to be there. You're going to have to deal with this. The things that he's saying, you're going to have to reckon with at some time. You might as well do it now, and it's quite pleasant actually. And it's only going to enhance your understanding of Prabhupada and kind of help to make your faith more reasonable, more well-reasoned and balanced, rather than, making it a balancing act, standing on one leg. And in a very fundamentalist kind of dogmatic way, everything is absolute. And it's kind of just a recipe for niyamagraha, following rules without understanding their purpose. And it's a whole International Society for Niyamagraha. So you want to avoid that kind of a thing. That's not what he formed. So, and just practice speaking, context is everything, right? Something may have a meaning outside of context. That's true, and it may be profound. But if you put it in context, like we voice so many, and they hightailed it home. What does that mean? Where does that come from? Look it up. It refers to cows running with their tails up, coming home, from the pasture. So then it goes, wow, that's very much charming. Or where the sayings, come from. So context is useful. So, it's a very important point that many people, unfortunately, have not come to understand. They're hindered by it. Thank you for asking. Anything else?
So, sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't unmuted earlier. So there's quite a few questions. Vrindavan Das had a question, Uddhava, Indra, and maybe another one from Sharada. So I'll just read what Vrindavan Das typed. So it said, why did Bhaktivinoda give Harinam and Diksha to Lalit Prasad and not Bhakti Siddhanta?
It would be difficult to give a definitive answer. We weren't there. We don't know. It's he said, she said over about 100 years or so, or more. And I would say for good reason. What particularly was the reason? I don't think I could say in a way that it would be universally accepted necessarily. There are detractors who have their reasons that don't add up and don't make sense because they make Bhaktisiddhanta out to be non-spiritual in their perspective on that. That obviously doesn't make any sense. So one reason may be that Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he he had some issues with the initiating guru of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bipin Bihari Goswami. He had kind of a sense that Bhaktisiddhanta, there was more in Bhaktisiddhanta or Bhaktivinoda than was in Bipin Bihari Goswami. He had some sense like that. And so perhaps for that reason, Bhaktivinoda Thakur said, well, we take the Gaura Das Babaji. Another reason is that Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a householder. Bhaktisiddhanta was a renunciated brahmachari. Gaura Kishore was a renunciated in brahmachari. And he was very much respected by Bhaktivinoda Thakur and universally respected at the time as a Siddha Purusha. He used to come and hear Gaura Kishore lectures of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and Bhaktisiddhanta was in the mix as a son of Bhaktivinoda. And so anything, Bhaktivinoda may have found some reason, oh, he's better connected with Gaura Kishore than me. That may be good for him in terms of the long-term mission that I have, and extending it and so forth. Bhaktivinoda was a person of some controversy. He was in a battle to establish what was the birthplace of Bhakti, of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and this was then there was opposition to that. He became controversial in this regard in the eyes of his own guru, Bipin Bihari Goswami. He might have wanted to keep Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur out of that, have him initiated by someone that no one could complain about, and so forth. Those are some thoughts on the matter. But he was initiated by Gaura Kishore Das Babaji, and he began initiating disciples himself, Bhaktisiddhanta, in the presence of Gaura Kishore Das Babaji and Bhaktivinoda Thakur for a few years before they both passed away, obviously with their blessings. So why did it was later in his life, at the end of his life, that he gave initiation to the younger brother, Late Prasad. And he had obviously a different trajectory. Late Prasad had a trajectory that was internal, and he had no voice in the world, no kind of influence. But Bhaktisiddhanta had a different destiny, and perhaps in consideration of that possibility or that hope on the part of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he sought to have him initiated by Gaura Kishore Das Babaji. There may be internal reasons for it also, but as I say, no one could say other than Bhaktivinoda.
Do you want to answer the next question?
What is it?
Trying to find it. Let me see. Okay, so the next question is from Urava from Spain. And it said, can you expand on the idea given by Sridhar Maharaj on the different moods of preaching by Bhaktivinoda in comparison to Bhaktisiddhanta?
Well, let's say I say, it'd be nice if there was a rose garden here. Say we're sitting and taking prasadam, and say it'd be nice if we had a rose garden. That means someone should make a rose garden, but it's a way of saying it that's rather indirect. And then I could say, I want a rose garden, and it should be right out here, and I want you to do it. So that's the difference between Bhaktivinoda and Bhakti Siddhanta, something like that. Bhaktivinoda would meet with different persons, even that he was criticizing, and discuss with them. And some of them Bhaktisiddhanta wouldn't even meet with. He was more confrontational. But again, you could say that in terms of reforming a tradition, which was the intention of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and something that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur took up seriously, he, I should say that he took it up seriously also in light of the fact that his own effort to just do what Bhaktivinoda Thakur wanted, that required innovation for world preaching, was meeting with exception from the tradition, which, so then he had to answer back. And by the way, there's things about you that should be brought up as well. It was kind of, the place he found himself in. Whereas Bhaktivinoda Thakur was not in that position. He had an idea. Bhaktisiddhanta was giving shape to the idea. So when you start giving shape to the idea, then the idea starts to become practical, and it has puts more pressure on people to change and so forth than just thoughts about it. And so, they had to navigate the course differently with a different mentality, different disposition. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur looked a little more hands-off, and Bhaktivinoda Saraswati Thakur looked a little more hands-on. But again, that's the difference between an idea and giving shape to an idea. What else?
So the next question is from Indra. And she says, Hare Krishna Maharaj, in light of preaching the essence of universality, what do you think of the broadcasting work of Jay Shetty?
I don't know who he is. I guess I'm not universal enough.
I think he's a devotee who, I don't know, Haridas is in the other room, but he does kind of like self-help kind of stuff and like motivational speaking is my understanding. Yeah, it's basically what I know about him.
Yeah, well, I don't know him, but there are some devotees that are preoccupied with that. I would think it's rather superficial. It's a good thing, self-help for people, psychological help and so forth. I think that's good in itself, but I think that it lends to a very, very superficial explanation of the philosophy to get people involved on a superficial level, which then they'll have to contend with later on what the philosophy really says. To give an example, if you say, well, this is personalism. You're a person, right? You're an individual. And they go, yeah, right. And Mayavadis say that you're impersonal. Yeah, so you don't want that, right? Yeah, so they get involved. But then they have to learn later on that the person that you think you are, is not who you are. And all that you're doing to balance yourself and so forth is good in one sense, but it's all an ego that has to be effaced. Maybe it's a stage in becoming healthy to do that, but it has to be done and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose, I would say with the dissemination of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the hands of different people, it's going to come out in different ways and appeal to different people. And there'll always be some necessity to preach on a deeper level as to what it's about, which is more my preoccupation. So I don't listen to that stuff too much. It has its value. It tends to be religious rather than spiritual, I would say, more religious. Join a group and be happy. And there's something to be said for that. I mean, even mystics need a, in one sense, we would do well to have a religious community behind them, and then their ideas could have some support. But I'm not familiar with the individual. I've seen some people have, some devotees have podcasts, and I think they a little
I
bit
think he might have a podcast.
want to be talking heads. I don't know. I think they could. I'm a little critical. I think that if people are going to do that, they need to be educated in the field very well. Also, they're going to look a little, and I'm not saying this person is because I don't know, they're going to look a little foolish, but I've seen a couple. I saw one yesterday, a podcast by some devotees, and it was very, very pseudo intellectual, unbeknownst to them. I think they thought they were being very intellectually sound and tight, and so it was rather childish in terms of my insight on it. So you want to avoid that. So if you're going to do something like that, you want to do it right, I suppose. Anyway, again, I don't know the person. So.
And then the last question from Sharada, she says, at Sharanagati here, we will be continuing through the book Sharanagati, which has the life of Srila Bhaktivinoda at the request of Yamuna Devi before she passed away. I have a very emotionally stirring experience when we sing his songs in Bengali. I'm half Bengali. What is the feeling or sentiments felt by you, or Maharaj, if he's answering the question, so I'm guessing she's asking for what your thoughts are.
My thoughts are on?
So I think thoughts on like, okay, I have a very emotionally stirring experience when we sing these songs in Bengali. I guess like she's wondering like, what are the sentiments felt by you when you're singing these songs from Sharanagati?
Well, the songs of Sharanagati are to help us embrace the idea of Sharanagati. So they should be very stirring and very compelling for the sadhaka. So in sadhana bhakti, which precedes bhava bhakti as a stage, then Sharanagati is the main emphasis. So Bhaktivinoda is in particular amongst Gaudiya theologians has really brought this out. Sharanagati is an anga of bhakti, a limb of bhakti, of the body of bhakti. Bhaktivinoda Thakura has emphasized this limb considerably, and he has insightfully connected Shraddha, inner faith, with the outer expression of Sharanagati, which is sixfold. And so he has a couple songs about each of the angas of the limb of Sharanagati. They're the sub-angas of Sharanagati. And so they're very, very powerful, and you should have a stirring of the heart to surrender as they, to give up the things that are unfavorable, accept the things that are favorable, and so on and so forth. So it's very helpful on the part of Bhaktivinoda Thakur to put that into song. We can imagine for Bengalis like herself at the time he was writing, taking these philosophical ideas and putting them in song, in poetry to recite, and then they serve as an impetus to actually take up those angas, and they cause some stirring. So this is characteristic of Bhaktivinoda. He also wrote some songs in the he has a book called Baul Sangit. So he took the melodies of the bowls. Bowls is about they're a sect that is not influenced by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but not within the Orthodox teachings. And you've probably seen them on the train come on with an ektar and sing beautifully and weep and so forth. They're interesting people. But from a theological point of view, they're not in line with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teachings as it comes through the Goswamis. But he took the melodies in this book, Baul Sangeet, that were popular, and he then wrote songs that had the proper siddhanta. So it's another example of what he's doing there with Sharanagati. Particularly for a person who speaks Bangla like yourself, which is a great virtue, Ami Bangla Puri, but it takes a while. So I can understand it would be stirring. For those who sing it like us, I mean, I know, as I say, I'm learning Bengali. I'm always learning. Or those who sing it don't know the Bengali, the English translations are good, but I think it's, you're fortunate to be part Bengali and speak the language, and some of the nuances can be appreciated more readily. But they're powerful spiritual songs, regardless of the language, and an example of the ways in which Bhaktivinoda Thakur kind of tried to make Gaudiya Vaishnavism in its pristine form, philosophically accessible to a larger audience, and you're a testament to the fact that he's done that. So it's a very nice idea there at the community of Sharanagati to recite those songs. There should be someone who comes and gives it a lecture to accompany them. That would be a nice seminar. You can ask Bal Krishna about that. They can arrange such a seminar. They bring some sadhu in, speak on the songs, Sharanagati. That would be beautiful. So anyway, we talked for a while. Appreciate the questions and opportunity to speak to you all. Hope to be available and get together with you again next week. Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai.
Jai.
Gaud
Thank
Premanand.
you.
Haribo. Jai.